Because even here he points out that, you know, a lot of the things that they predict, well, they predict a lot of things that are wrong and some things that are right. Well, everybody gets a few things right. So Augustine never spends a lot of time with it, but it's sort of emblematic of the fact that even in this long Manichaean period, even there he was doing other kinds of explorations to find out how things are and why things are.
But of course, again, interesting speculation. It's hard to know for sure. One of the things that's sort of interesting later on is that he spends an awful lot of time refuting astrology, giving reasoned arguments about why astrology as a predictive power, something that's able to tell you what your life is going to be in the future, is necessarily bogus. And it's been argued, and I think with a good deal of plausibility, that he wouldn't maybe have spent that much time on it if it weren't something that he was at least tempted to earlier on in his life. And it's also been, you know, what the speculation has been that astrology also was connected in some ways with practices of the Manichees, so that to do one is to involve yourself, at least to a certain extent, in the other. And that might have something to do with what's going on here as well.
The largest segment of Book 4 of the Confessions is, in fact, a return to a discussion of friendship. After all, Augustine is now an adult and entering into a somewhat different kind of relationship with his friends than he had when he was a little guy or when he was a teenager, when we've already seen him as a friend and with his group of friends. As it turns out, Augustine goes back for a while to live in and teach in his hometown of Thagaste. And while he is there, he sort of takes up again a somewhat different relationship with one of his little buddies from where he was born. At this same period, when I first began to teach in the town where I was born, I had a friend who shared my interest and was exceedingly dear to me. He was the same age as myself and, like me, now in the flower of young manhood. As a boy, he had grown up with me. We had gone to school together and played together. He was not then such a friend to me as he was to become later, though even at the later time of which I speak, our union fell short of true friendship. Okay, it wasn't like when we were little guys, but as I look back on it, for all the goodness of that relationship I had with this guy, who, by the way, Augustine never names, he says it wasn't full, it wasn't complete. Like a lot of other things, Augustine's doing a little bit better in friendship than he did as a child or as an adolescent. But as he looks back, he sees as a part of his whole development on this issue, too, he's got a ways to go.
Just before we continue the discussion of Augustine, let's see how Cicero might be hovering over this passage as well. It probably is as good a place as any to say that what Cicero defines friendship as is an agreement agreement on all things in heaven and earth, so that mutual agreement becomes for Cicero the touchstone in terms of the nature of friendship. And it's interesting to see how Augustine kind of takes that and transforms it, both in talking about what the friendship was lacking and ultimately in terms of what true friendship is going to consist in. Because, of course, later on, that kind of agreement is going to be paramount when we see later on the folks who are instrumental in his conversion. The agreement, in other words, turns out to be, from what Augustine's point of view, is the most important things.
Well, as it turns out, Augustine's friend became ill. And during his illness, without his knowledge, he was sort of zonked out, he was baptized. And, of course, Augustine knew this. So when his friend sort of comes to, Augustine approaches him on this and wants to sort of chastise him about it, kid him about it, joke around about the, oh, you know what they did? They, dumped some water in your head and thought they did something super while you were out. Let's laugh about that a little bit. And he was stunned by his friend's response, which was not to join in the laughter, but to tell him never to talk like this again, and to show a kind of confidence and independence that Augustine had never seen in him before.
So Augustine is puzzled by this, to say the least. He, at the time certainly, doesn't understand why his friend responded the way he did. And it's almost as though, gosh, we gotta work this one out, because stuff that I thought we could agree on, the attitude that I thought we shared as friends, that's no longer there. And so it's as though he's about to embark on a kind of dialogue with this guy to see where you've gone wrong, but in fact something more important happens, and that is that the friend dies at this time, and Augustine has to deal with an issue a lot more significant.
The way that Augustine responds is really quite powerfully described in the Confessions. Again, let me read you a little bit. Black grief closed over my heart, and wherever I looked I saw only death. My native land was a torment to me, and my father's house unbelievable misery. Everything I had shared with my friend turned into hideous anguish without him. My eyes sought him everywhere, but he was missing. I hated all things because they held him not, and could no more say to me, "Look, here he comes," as they had been wont to do in his lifetime when he had been away. Augustine can't walk down the streets of Thagaste anymore. He can't, in a sense, even go into his own house, because every place he is, what strikes him is the absence of this friend. It's not the same. Life is miserable, even right here in my own hometown and my own home. He was, he believed, grieving for the loss of his friend.
Lots of different ways that he could have looked at it, okay? One of which, of course, is that later on, as a Christian, he would be able to say that there's something good for his friend because his friend is now in the presence of God. That thought isn't there. So what he does is he weeps a lot, and he is unable to be consoled. Just as a kind of footnote here, it's interesting to see throughout the Confessions where Augustine weeps and where Augustine doesn't. Remember, the last time was that he was weeping over the fate of Dido. Now he has something a lot more personal and a lot more real to weep over, but there's a connection between the two, because I think that there is more than a subtle suggestion here that Augustine's weeping over the death of his friend is misdirected, in the sense that it really turns out to be about Augustine rather than about the friend. That what Augustine turns out to be weeping for is more like himself and the loss that he has, the loss that he has endured, and equally, I think, his inability to make sense out of the situation. Okay, if this friend dies, then all of a sudden I have to look on life in a totally new way. Things that once made sense to me don't make any sense at all at this point, and I haven't figured out a way to put it all together. So in doing this, Augustine really does become self-absorbed in a way that, again, is reminiscent of those earlier examples that we used previously. And it's important to zero in on this amazing tension as Augustine describes it later on.
Think back to the way Augustine in Book 2 described his dad. His dad, on the surface, looked like this really good dad, sort of forking out the big bucks to send him off to school, while inside, Augustine tells us, it really was a kind of selfishness. Well, okay, let's update that now, with Augustine being the figure. On the surface, people look at him and say, boy, look at this guy. He really loved this young man who died. What a good friend he is. He's weeping, he's sad, he's grieving. Oh, how he must have loved him. On the surface, Augustine looks like an ideal guy mourning this great personal loss and regretting the death of his friend. But as Augustine lets us look inside him from the perspective of the author, written about 20 years after this event happened, he says, this grief was really much more about me than it was about him. It wasn't quite, but it was almost as if he said, how dare this guy die and leave me like this?
I was going to sort of present it this way, that if Augustine, you've got a chance to ask your friend one question, or he's going to come back, listen to a question. The question Augustine would ask is, why did you do that to me? Again, it's about Augustine rather than about the friend. And again, significantly, as Bill said before, the fact that the friend is not named is another way, I think, of maybe getting at the same issue.
And it leads Augustine to think about something else. Friendship is indeed, he says, and he has said it before, he will say it again, a good thing. But it's not the best thing, because by definition, it can't last forever. And we all know, and Cicero talks about this, that friendships are subject to change. One friend can go bad, or interests can change. Or, in fact, this is the context in which Cicero writes the treatise on friendship. It's put in the form of a dialogue, and most of it is spoken by a guy whose best friend has just died. In fact, that's what happens in friendship. Somebody dies before somebody else. And so Augustine tells us, not intellectually obviously, but he's been living with the kind of illusion that this impermanent, although good, friendship is in fact permanent. It never occurred to him that this could be altered, that this could be changed, or it could be rendered finished by the death of his friend.
It also seems to me that if you look at this in the context of what Augustine has been looking for in the last part of the Confessions, that is to say, okay, I'm out looking for wisdom with a capital W, that search hasn't helped him very much in coming to terms with this. That nothing that he has learned up to this time gives him a way of dealing with the issue, and so characteristically he becomes the Augustine of the early book, somebody who sees everything in terms of himself, and somebody who only has that standard as a way to judge what's going on. So in the final analysis, mourning himself rather than his friend, we see how far he is from a wisdom that allows him to deal with the issue. Once again, I think it's important to kind of look forward just a little bit, because one way that we can look at some of the later incidents, there are going to be a lot of people very close to Augustine who die, most notably his mother. We have to ask ourselves not only how does Augustine respond, let's say when his mother dies, but how we take that incident and compare it with this one. In other words, we can see an awful lot about the way that Augustine has made progress, about the degree of progress that Augustine has made by comparing, let's say, the death of the friend here with the death of his mother later on, a story that he recounts in fact, more detail than this one.
It's also interesting now to remember that Augustine, after all, is a professional teacher. Remember what he said about his teachers back in Book 1. They couldn't teach me what I needed because they themselves didn't know it. That is to say, they were not oriented toward higher things, and therefore they couldn't teach me to be oriented toward higher things. As this story reveals to some extent how Augustine still hasn't got this permanent, impermanent thing figured out, he still is very much oriented towards self and career and satisfactions in this world. One wonders in the larger sense, not as a technical teacher, but one wonders in the larger sense how good a teacher Augustine is, because in some real way he is indeed imitating the very teachers that he has criticized in Book 1 of Confessions.
And so again, these two strands of Augustine's life come together. The professional, this sense of how I'm making my way in the world, and the vast chasm between that and what's going on with him personally. He does, in this book, by the way, go back to the issue of searching for wisdom. Where are some other places that he goes to? Well, in fact, before the book ends, he comes back to that trail. But I think it's no accident that the central episode of this book is the death of his friend and the response to it. And in addition to those other places where we're going to see Augustine dealing with death, we also sort of need this as a kind, we need to bookmark this for the other places where Augustine talks specifically about friendship, even before he gets to the moment where those friends are going to help him convert. Because again, the kind of gradual change in Augustine's understanding of what friendship is all about is one of the things that is very important in the trail that Augustine is leaving for us.
In one of the early lectures, we said, when looking at the city of God, that Augustine ultimately saw that one starts with these most intimate human relationships, and from those relationships build the model of what it means to be a good citizen in the larger sense of Roman citizen, but also ultimately as part of, as he will later become, a Christian community. In other words, we really have those relationships as models. Well, here's a question. If Augustine's all messed up on the friendship thing, if friendship is ultimately all about some sort of pleasing him, stroking his ego, making him feel good, and operating under the illusion that this friendship is absolutely going to last forever, at least living with that fiction and sort of pretending it's going to be so, how is Augustine going to function in the larger world of social relationships and the less and less impersonal relationships, whether it is as a citizen in the Roman Empire or whether it is as a member of a Christian community? That we don't just start out saying, what's it mean to love our neighbors as ourselves, with our neighbors being across the seas or somebody we run into in the streets now and then. The way we develop that understanding is with those relationships that are most intimate to us. If they're messed up, how can we then walk onto that larger, less personal stage? So this not only has ramifications, I think, in the story of the Confessions itself, and in looking at the relationship of Augustine with a text like Cicero, but it also is part of the largest categories in which Augustine thinks throughout his life.
I would just want to make one other reflection on friendship, and that is that maybe we wouldn't admit to this, but it's sort of interesting if you begin thinking about who the people are that you have as friends, how many of them are folks who tell you how cool you are in one way or another, people who like you, and that kind of that kind of manifests itself in their saying, well, you're a good guy. And you kind of hear that and are reinforced by it. It's hard to know when that shades over into flattery, which is, of course, another issue that's in Cicero, one of the big issues in Cicero that is implicit in Augustine as well. And one wonders if a test of friendship is not a friend is a person who is able to tell you when you're screwing up, a person who tells you when you're not doing very well. What's interesting about the narrative here is that Augustine didn't really think consciously that this friend was somebody who was there to stroke his ego until the friend wasn't around anymore. In other words, it was only in the loss that we see the the kind of misdirection of what friendship was all about. And I think that's an interesting point to make as well.
There's one interesting passage toward the end of this section before we get to the final part of Book 4 of the Confessions. Augustine says, I was prepared even to think you, meaning God, changeable, rather than admit that I was not what you are. It's interesting because in some ways, of course, what he's suggesting is that he still is seeing God in terms of God as a kind of reflection of Augustine rather than Augustine as a reflection or made in the image and likeness of God. He still got it all backwards. He's still all turned around. And this challenge to his thinking with the death of his friend has not, in fact, caused the kind of, well, let me stand back and see how I got this wrong, but rather he sort of draws the wrong conclusions, it seems to me, from this experience.
Yeah, another way to put it, what he's saying to God is, hey, it's not fair that things change. Oh, I guess it's okay because you change too. So that this is a way of Augustine sort of seeing how God is made in his image and likeness rather than the other way around.
And how do you know that God changes? Well, you know that because at one point God says it's okay to, this is where we go back to an earlier text, to sacrifice animals and have more than one wife. And now God says you can't do those things. So that proves that God changes. And remember, that's one of those issues all the way back to Book 3 he is struggling with, and we can see how that error that he makes in his thinking has ramifications in his life as he goes on and faces various challenges.
One other aspect of Augustine's search for wisdom comes at the end of this book, and he talks about what he learned from another of the great thinkers of classical antiquity, Aristotle. And it's interesting in this case that for us it's important not only to see what Augustine does learn, but what he doesn't learn from Aristotle. He turns to a book of Aristotle, and remember, once again, as in all of these texts from the Greek world, Augustine would have been reading them in translation, sometimes maybe even in paraphrase. He takes a book of Aristotle, reads it, and studies it, a book called The Categories, which is also which is a book about how to classify things correctly, what Aristotle was the great master of course. So in a way, what he's learning from Aristotle is what Aristotle most has to teach. He reads it, he learns something, but he doesn't learn all that much.
Yeah, he talks about the fact that, well, this book is called The 10 Categories, and he says, I was so, in some ways, taken by this book, and the argument of Aristotle, he's a pretty persuasive guy, after all, that I even figured out which category you belong in. I sort of, got everything. It helped me sort of get things in the right places, as Ron said. But of course, as he looks back, he says, wow, God doesn't fit into Aristotelian categories. I was really not, in fact, moving forward in what I was looking for in this particular way by using the writings of Aristotle, this great Greek thinker of 700 years before Augustine lived. And in many ways, although this is hardly the only time that Augustine ever mentions Aristotle, the verdict on Aristotle, shall we say, of marginal use to Augustine in his journey toward God, becomes, because of the influence of Augustine in later centuries, a verdict that, at least in Western Christianity, lasts for, well, not quite, but most of 1,000 years.
Yeah, in other words, this is one of those cases where what the text from the Confessions tells us is something outside of the text itself. What we're talking about now is really the absence of Aristotle in Augustine. If we were simply limiting ourselves to the story of Augustine, we would say, looked at Aristotle, got a little bit out of it, but from his point of view, not one of the heavyweights, not one of the people who really told him where he was going. Well, in point of fact, what happens is for the next 1,000 years, Aristotle ceases to be a heavyweight, and it's only in the 13th century, well, 12th century, but mostly the 13th, where Aristotle became important again, where translations of Aristotle were made again so that people could read him, where there are even a few people in the West who began reading Aristotle in Greek, and where he became once again a major player. It's interesting that the person who is sort of the chief rival to Augustine in the Christian tradition as the great Christian heavyweight thinker, Thomas Aquinas, is somebody who is steeped in Aristotle and who makes use of Aristotle in his own system, and that the most interestingly, the fundamental difference between Augustine and Aquinas is Aquinas' reliance on and use of Aristotle. So it's a sort of footnote, but a footnote that is important for 1,000 years of intellectual history. Once again, we can look at Augustine and see him as being kind of a bellwether for things that are going to come, even though that was clearly not his intent here.
So where are we? Well, we had a little test with astrology, and that didn't work at all, and we had a little experiment with Aristotle, and that worked a little bit, but not very much. That we see his intellectual life moving forward in Book 4, even though by spurts and starts. It's hardly a steady progression once he read Cicero. He doesn't just get a little bit wiser every day. But more than that, as Ron suggested earlier, as we look at the personal story that is the center of Book 4, the story of his friendship, we see that whatever progress he is making intellectually isn't having much of an impact on the way he deals with his personal lives and his personal relationships.
In the next lecture, we'll see what happens when Augustine moves from North Africa, from Carthage, to Italy, first to Rome and then to Milan, and to see his continuing journey, the physical geographic one, as a kind of mirror of the spiritual one. In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at Book 5 of the Confessions.